back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Kevin Kosar. Kevin is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, a Washington, D.C. think tank, where he studies the U.S. Congress, congressional oversight, the administrative state, American politics, and the U.S. Postal Service. He is the author of several books, including Ronald Reagan and Education Policy, Failing Grades, The Federal Politics of Education, Whiskey, A Global History, and Moonshine, A Global History. Typically, we focus on the extensive and encompassing themes surrounding beer. However, today we look to Kevin on his expertise that are more geared towards a harder form of alcohol. This is, of course, whiskey. Kevin received his Ph.D. in politics from New York University and currently lives in Washington, D.C. We're excited to speak to Kevin and learn more about his exciting career and passion towards politics and whiskey. So without further ado, Kevin, welcome to the Beer Bound Podcast. How are you doing?
Well, thanks for having me on, Andy.
Thank you. The pleasure is ours. So we've kind of delved into who you are a little bit, your interests in both whiskey and politics. I'm sure your life is far more profound. So could you jump in and explain a little bit more about yourself and why you're interested in these two particular fields?
Well, the trite answer is if you pay much attention to politics, you're probably going to feel drawn to drink. But for me, the real history is that these interests kind of developed concurrently. You know, I was studying politics as an undergraduate at the Ohio State University, and I got a job working for Ohio State's faculty club. It was a fancy restaurant with a little bar, and they made me the bartender, even though I didn't know anything about bartending. And I had the great fortune of having a boss, two bosses actually, who told me, look, we have some sophisticated clientele here. You know, it's professors and visiting professors and guests of the university who come to our schnazzy restaurant. You got to know what you're talking about back there. You got to know what you're doing and what you're pouring. So part of your homework is that we want you to taste everything behind the bar. And being 21 years old, I was like, sign me up. And so I started tasting stuff behind the bar, everything from Australian wines to dark beers to then, the various types of whiskey they had, which were bourbons and scotches and a bit of Irish, and taking notes on it. And very quickly, I was just astonished at how little I knew about drink, despite growing up in Ohio, where there's a real culture of drink. And, these kind of parallel paths of studying U.S. government and politics, and at the same time learning more about beverages, went right on through graduate school. I got up to New York University, where I got a master's degree and Ph.D. in politics. But along the way, I was, reading more about drink. At that time, this was the early 90s, there wasn't much of an internet. So I was doing it in the library. Anywhere you walked in New York City, then as today, you could step in a place and find drink that you've never seen before. For a simple Ohio boy to step into a little corner mart and to see Belgian liquors and Belgian brews and tall bottles and that, it was just mind-blowing. And I kept thinking, I don't even know what this is. I'll just buy it, taste it, and then go read about it in the library and see if I could figure it out. While I was all doing that over the course of the 90s, the internet bloomed and I started writing for a bar newspaper, but I kept the copyright on the bar reviews, the booze reviews I was writing for the bar newspaper, and I started posting those online, and next thing you know, 1998, my site alcoholreviews.com was born. After that, there came the whiskey book, there came the Moonshine book, there came the professional career in think tanking and working at the Library of Congress as a nerd. It's a funny thing. It's not what I planned, but it's what happened.
What's more interesting, Kevin, alcohol or American politics?
I think when I was younger, I would have said alcohol. As I've gotten older, across the 50 barrier a few years ago, I appreciate politics a bit more, particularly because, it's the way that we diverse people try to figure stuff out collectively, which is kind of important. because if you can't do that, you either have anarchy or you have a rise of a strong man who's going to impose consensus upon us. And so figuring out how to make that work is pretty important. Certainly feels important to me. And different countries do it in different way. Different legislatures in the United States have their own ways of doing it. So there's always something to learn.
The early stages of the internet, you created alcoholreviews.com. Was that the title?
Yeah, which, believe it or not, is still out there.
Yeah. Have you kept up on this? How is the website doing today?
When I started it, there was only like 2 other websites on alcohol online. One was Wine Spectator and one was some home brewing site. And so when I started this thing where I was reviewing beers, wines, and spirits, very quickly it got extremely popular. And it was a very funny thing to be a poor graduate student who is, eating cheap bags of pasta for dinner. And all of a sudden I had public affairs professionals in fancy New York City firms calling me up, sending me emails and saying, well, we've got these samples of scotch we'd like you to consider for review. Can we send them over? Oh, if you must. I became very popular in graduate school because my dingy little apartment became like a library for alcohol. I mean, FedEx man, UPS man were dear friends of mine because they showed up nearly daily bringing me samples. It was terrific.
It just sounds amazing.
Yeah, the site's still out there. It's got reviews going back to 1998. It's got other essays, some videos. I do more very kind of short takes on social media now on interesting drinks I find. I mean, ultimately, what I want is for people not to waste their money. I think I have a pretty common palate. I'm not one of these super sophisticated palates who can pick up 20 notes with a single sip. And so I just think about the people I grew up with who, they walk into a grocery store and they're kind of bewildered by the choices, and I don't want them to waste their money. And I say, okay, well, if you want a beer that's really robust in flavor, well, go for this particular porter. Well, you want a beer that's a little bit milder, but not quite as, weak as Bud Light. Why don't you try this wheat beer? That's what I try to do with the site.
I like that. That's a good mandate. Typically, most people are like, oh, I just want to share my knowledge, or I want to spread the good word. You go cut right to the chase. I don't want people to waste their money, which is also great. People value that very, very much. And I just pulled it up here, your website. It looks really cool. And there's even a heading that says booze politics. So you got a little mix there.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, booze politics go back from the start. As soon as we had alcohol, we had authorities of one sort or another trying to make rules about it. I mean, even you go back to Hammurabi 1,000+ years ago. He had some rules on drink and how it could be served and when it could be served and things like that. So yeah, the two go together: alcohol, politics, governance. Yep.
Kevin, I feel like the URL alcoholreviews.com, that's a pretty good one to have. I feel like someone maybe would have wanted to buy that off of you.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, when I created the site, that was back in the day where the ultimate goal of the internet entrepreneur was to create a portal. And one way you would create a portal is that you would buy multiple domain names. So I had alcoholreviews.com, beerreviews.com, spiritsreviews.com, and winesreviews.com. I had them all. And over time, as I got busy with my career and had 4 kids and all that other stuff, I just started selling off some of the other small ones, the other parts of the site, and held on to alcohol reviews.
Okay. Maybe for a sale down the road. Or, I mean, are you still keeping up with you're still adding reviews to the site today or not so much?
Some posts on the site. I came across a stash of whiskey bottles from the 1950s that somebody I knew was renovating a house, and they tore out the walls and these empty bottles had been put in there. And I was like, ooh, alcohol archaeology. So I took photos of the various, the tax stamps on there and the labels. I mean, these are long dead brands, and posted that on the site. Otherwise, the beers I've been reviewing, the other things I've been reviewing, those mostly go out on quick reviews on social media,
right?
Twitter in particular.
So as a young man, Kevin, you had the pick of the litter in terms of experimentation and sampling of different alcoholic beverages. But then in your later adult years, you specialize. You've written a couple books, one on moonshine, one on whiskey, perhaps, I mean, other articles as well, obviously, on the internet and in a virtual capacity. But having a profound interest in whiskey, where does that come from? Obviously, there are many different assortments and varieties of alcohol. Why whiskey?
I think I was drawn by the fact that it was so complex. And I was also, to a degree, drawn by the fact that much of what was happening in the whiskey world when I got into it was in, Anglophone countries. I am not a guy who could write a book on the history of absinthe. Why? Well, most of the history is Eastern European and French. And I don't have the language abilities to do that sort of research. But whiskey, which was, a product of the English islands, Scotland, Ireland, the like, and migrated over to the United States. I mean, that was certainly doable. But yeah, I mean, it goes back to being behind the bar at the faculty club, and you're just looking at these labels, and it's like, wait a minute, all right, this is Scotch, this is blended Scotch, this is single malt Scotch, and then it doesn't say anything about bourbon versus bonded bourbon versus, the varying proofs and everything. I mean, why is Bushmills and Irish whiskey taste so very, very different from Jameson's, which we had behind the bar? It was just, there was so much complexity there. And the more I stuck my nose into that complexity, the more baffled I got, and the more I wanted to unpuzzle it.
Yeah, Kevin. So Garrett and I were more accustomed to the history as well as the current trends and the fabrication or the makeup of beer and what goes in terms of the four main ingredients. But give us Whiskey 101. What is whiskey and how do you make it? What is it composed of?
Simplest definition. Whiskey is a distilled spirit derived from a cereal grain that has been barrel aged. So those are the three components. And in terms of the process, it's really make a beer, distill the beer, meaning heating it up so that the fumes come up, the alcohol fumes come up and then condense and turn back into liquid, creating the distillate. And then the last is aging it in a barrel. So those are the three kind of simple stages. So yeah, I mean, the relationship between beer and whiskey is close. Beer makers often evolve into whiskey makers.
Give us some more rules around how it is comprised and what you have to do in terms of the fermentation process? Isn't there, I mean, before we even get into the varieties of whiskey and like the different types, because there are many and they have their own particular locations to which they hail from. But what are the rules around the fermentation process, the amount of time that you have to ferment a whiskey? What are the rules that surround this?
Oh boy, yeah, it's all over the road. I mean, whiskey making is best practices mixed in with science, mixed in with some regulations, or even laws, depending on the country. Yeah, it's kind of nuts. This is why, and I don't want to jump ahead. This is why, there's a lot of confusion over the types of whiskey, because when you break down the way that we've labeled different types of whiskey, fundamentally it's incoherent. It's not a rational typology. It's something that's been whacked together by human beings over time. But yeah, no, I tell people that, the basic process of whiskey making is simple. It's threefold. But actually doing it is extraordinarily hard. What you're doing is you're taking hard seeds, trying to coax out the sugars, and then take those sugars and use yeast to trigger the production of alcohol. But that alcohol is then in the midst of all this other glop and stuff. It's like a thick, soupy type thing. So somehow you got to get the alcohol out of there. But then even once you have the alcohol out of there, there's not just one type of alcohol. Alcohol is a varied chemical compound. And there are some types of alcohol that you don't want to drink. Whiskey makers in the old days would refer to kind of the heads and the tail and the heart of the distillate cut. Some parts you don't want because it tastes bad or it'll make you sick. And then you get to the aging process, and boy, talk to people who are new to distilling. that's probably one of the most terrifying things for them, because having advanced through all these stages and putting something in a barrel, they're just hoping it turns out okay. And whether what they put in the barrel, what came off their particular still from their particular combination of grains, works well being aged 2 years, 3 years, 3.25 years. Should the room and the temperature be higher, lower? What's the relative humidity in the room? Oh my goodness. And if you're using barrels that have been charred, burned on the inside, how deep a char you should use, there's so much that can go wrong. And you can end up just producing a whiskey that's not like going to make you sick, but it's just not going to sell well. Years of labor, all that activity, and you end up with something that people are going, yeah, whiskey making is complex stuff. It is chemistry.
A lot of interesting steps along the way. We've read a little bit about it, but have you ever tried your hand at distilling anything, perhaps?
No, done plenty of home brewing, and the most formal education I had in whiskey making was it was probably 20 years ago. I spent a week at Brooklady Distillery in Islay, in Scotland. And that was a non-computerized distillery. That was old school. So, I mean, hauling bags of barley and going through the process, big wooden vats. 2:00 in the morning was when, the distillation process was ready to hit a particular stage. And that's when you had to be awake and do it. And so I was standing there in the middle of the night wearing rubber boots and being coached by this old guy who was missing teeth from his mouth and listening to his crazy stories. I was just stunned. I was just stunned at the complexity of what these people were pulling off, and that human beings had ever figured this out.
Kevin, why do you need to leave the whiskey fermenting for 2 or 3 or 10 or 15 years? What is the process that happens in fermentation over that long period of time? As Garrett and I know, when you're leaving a beer in a fermenter, that can sometimes only be 4, maybe to 6 weeks. Like, it doesn't take very long. So what is going on in that process? Why does it take so long? Why is it a yearly expansive process?
Right. Okay. Well, I should have been clearer earlier. So the fermentation process, refers formally to the period when you have the yeast interacting with the sugars and alcohols being the output. Whiskey making, that goes on for a week, 2 weeks perhaps, and then they end it. Then they they sluice it over into the still proper, and that's when the heat gets applied, and what soup turns to vapor, and the vapor rises up and it goes into these tubes, and the tubes cool it, and then it starts coming out as a clear as water liquid. That's the distillate. Distillate then is going to move on to a barrel. Chemically, at that point, I mean, it's alcohol. It's very high proof alcohol, and it's not going to change much. What is going to happen is that in the course of being in the barrel, the whiskey or proto whiskey is going to get absorbed into the wood and released, depending on the humidity and a couple other factors. And in the course of moving in and out of the barrel, plus air getting in, it's going to take on certain characteristics. And that's why, you see whiskey coming off a still, it's clear as water. You taste it, it's hot. There's not much flavor to it. If you did barley versus wheat and compared that, with another cereal grain, you would taste slight differences, but it's only when it goes and sits in the barrel that the magic happens, and then the spirits become really differentiated in terms of their flavor.
Right. That was okay. Foolish question on my behalf. Not the fermentation process. It's more of the aging process, right?
Yeah.
Allowing for the alcohols to blend in with the barrels to create interesting and different flavors.
And it's a weird thing. Scotch, which is made primarily from barley, that stuff can go in a barrel and sit there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years and come out tasting grand. Bourbon, which is made, mostly from corn, doesn't age beyond 20 years. I think most distillers are really hesitant to go, past 10, 12 years with it. vast majority of it is 3, 4, 5, 6 years. It just doesn't get better. Why? Don't know.
Yeah,
Magic.
so it's just the magic. That's really interesting. So, okay, you've jumped into it a little bit. Obviously, if anyone knows a little bit about whiskey, they know that whiskey is kind of the main label on the top of the pyramid. And then when you're getting into the subcategories or the different versions of whiskey that exist, you have whiskeys that are more synonymous with different areas and with different grain makeup. So can you tell us a little bit about the different types of whiskey that exist, perhaps in the United States, on the British Isles, Canada?
Honestly, the categories are such a mess. And let me give you a brief example on why that illustrates why they're such a mess. Let's say you make a barley-based whiskey, you do it in Scotland, and you follow the basic rules to make Scotch whiskey. In the end, you can call it Scotch. What happens if you replicate that exact same process in Japan? Can you call it Scotch whiskey? No,
Apparently
even
not.
though it is essentially the same. You can't do it. This also happens in India. India makes a lot of barley-based whiskeys. If you don't know what's in the bottle and you took a taste of it, you'd say, oh yeah, it's a good Scotch. No, it's actually an Indian Scotch, and you can't call it Scotch. So, how do you make sense out of this chaos? Well, categories first based upon nation are useful. So you say Irish whiskey, you can say Scotch whiskey, you can say American whiskey, you can say Canadian whiskey, etc. And then within there, you can break it up into things like blends versus single malts. What's a blend? Well, that's when they make a pure whiskey, but then mix in some neutral spirit. That's stuff that's like vodka-like. That's a blend. So you get blends, you can do a single malts, you can do pure malts. So those are kind of three basic categories that you can play with, all under the kind of national category. But there are also these other legacy categories. In the United States, you can call it all American whiskey, but if it's mostly made from corn and it's put in charred barrels, then it can be called bourbon. If it's mostly made from rye, then it gets called rye. These regulations are all over the place. I put a little chart in my book, Whiskey: A Global History, trying to simplify it just for the newcomer to whiskey. And I was promptly savaged by some snobs who said, you missed all this nuance. And I said, well, you missed the point. If I tried to explain everything precisely, you would have had a chart going 4 pages, and the reader would have been baffled.
Going for simplicity. I was just going to say, do you have a chart or something? It sounds like you're like reading from an invisible chart, but it seems that you do. So yeah. And then I was just briefly perusing it as well while you were making an explanation, which was very helpful, by the way. I think you outlined that quite well. Like single malt versus single grain. And like, I guess the nuances just go on forever, it seems.
Yeah. And it's like in the beer world where, some regulations exist and will kind of create some clear categories. But in many cases, you just have producers making stuff up. We're going to call this a small batch bourbon. There is no legal definition of small batch, but people are saying that. Well, this is a handcrafted bourbon. Well, this is one thing or another. They make up things to try to differentiate their brands. They don't have a legal basis necessarily. So ultimately it boils down to a kind of advertising. But if enough people kind of do that, the categories take on a reality. I mean, 25, 30 years ago, there were only 1 or 2 types of IPAs. And now it's like I go in and I look and I'm like, what? I've never heard of that.
Oh man, the amount of times we've tried breaking down the IPA styles and it gets tough.
Yeah. I mean, distillers, it's a good sign. The confusion is a good sign, in fact, because what it means is that distillers and brewers are highly motivated to compete and to bring out new products. And so, the stuff that we're drinking today is way better than what we were drinking 30 years ago. And the breadth of the choice is so much better. And if you want to talk about 100, 200 years ago, forget about it. Today's world of drinks is the best world that has ever existed.
You broke down a little bit the process of distillation and distilling whiskey. And obviously that is a more complex, intricate process than just basically the way you would create a wine or a beer by just leaving it to be created, to be fermented, and then you drink it. Basically, distillation is far more complex. So where did that come from? Obviously, whiskey is not as old of a drink as beer is, because you need the machinery and the technology to go along with it. Where did distillation come from?
It was discovered in the ancient Middle East. I think the so-called ancient Alexandrian chemists were, given the credit for figuring it out and certainly writing about it the most. They were taking all sorts of substances and heating them up and trying to catch the vapors. A lot of it was experimentation with creating perfumes, with creating health tonics, rose water, and that sort of stuff. But at some point, somebody decided, like, well, let's take some of this beer, let's take some of this wine and put it in there, and see what effect we can get out of it. But the evidence is very, very murky because the historical record is so vague, and because, quite frankly, it was kind of anarchic lexicon back then. We didn't have dictionaries and settled definitions of words, and we didn't have government creating definitions for what stuff is. So people called things a variety of stuff, even as late as 200 years ago. In the English-speaking world, England, United States, Canada, you had people referring to pretty much any liquor as brandy. Whether it was made from fruit or made from grain, they called it brandy in some cases. So, getting the historical record clear and figuring out, who distilled first and when, it's really tricky. But I think the Alexandrian chemists were definitely, they knew the science, and they probably were the first ones to be able to turn a fermented beverage into a distilled one. Now, for whiskey, the best we got is a Scottish government record from the 1490s, where a friar, a holy man, had registered that he had bought a whole bunch of malt to make aquavita, which, aquavit, that was a word that referred to this kind of strong water, or this water of life. And that, considering the fact that the guy was clearly using grain, he was clearly distilling it, and more than likely, considering the quantities he was making, he probably had to put it in barrels to store it. He meets all three criteria as far as I can tell, and therefore qualifies as the first on-record whiskey maker.
Kevin, why, you said it's 1490? Is that what you said?
1490.
So,
I think it was 1492, but
Gotcha. So in the last 500 years or so, we know that whiskey has a prominent association with the Anglosphere. So the British Isles, England, Scotland, Ireland, you mentioned Canada, the United States. Why is that? Why didn't other parts of Europe, Northern, Central, Western Europe, why did they not gravitate as much towards whiskey? Or perhaps they did.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there is cursory evidence that suggests that maybe in the Balkans, folks were turning grain into a spirit. But we just don't have enough stuff from the time to make it clear. A lot of these people were not literate, so they weren't writing things down. So history gets made by the literate to some degree, whoever writes the stuff down. And, it also may reflect to some degree the prominence of grain growing in the UK versus widespread fruit growing in Eastern Europe. I mean, in Eastern Europe, they were making brandies left and right from a very early day. I mean, the science of distillation came out of, Alexandria, went in through Spain and the Mediterranean, and kind of the monks and the deep thinkers and scientists and alchemists of the day, and then kind of spread out in various ways. And, people were just experimenting. Whatever was the thing that they had lots of, you got tons of pears, you can afford to press some of those into cider and then see if we can distill it. Boom, let's give that a whirl. The UK certainly has its share of fruits, persimmons and pears and apples and things like that, but they also grew a ton of grain. And for whatever reason, that was what they started experimenting with quite a bit.
Kevin, looking at your country being a little bit younger in terms of its colonial heritage as opposed to Scotland or England, do you have a good sense of the United States cultural relationship with whiskey? Is it similar to something like beer? Is it more nuanced or different? Can you give us a little bit of context in terms of an American lens on America's relationship with whiskey?
Yeah, sure. The settlers who came from the various countries started landing here in sizable numbers in the 1600s, brought with them their brewing and their distilling, and in some case their vintning, their winemaking knowledge. There was an awful lot of fruit brandies made in early America. There was also a lot of rum made in early America. But the Irish and the English and the Scottish who came and settled often brought with them the skill of whiskey making, and they were also grain farmers first and foremost. There was a huge amount of land available, a huge amount of land that was good for growing these crops, and these crops certainly grow faster than fruit trees. It takes a long time to get a fruit tree to bear fruit. So grains became a big thing in early America. And what kind of flowed naturally from, this explosion in grain farming was a glut of grains. You got too much of this stuff. Well, what are you going to do with it? You had to borrow money to buy the seed. How are you going to reap back your investment? Well, okay, you can make some of it into beer and that'll keep a certain number of months. Easier thing to do is to distill it because you can sell it at a higher price, and something that's distilled doesn't spoil. If you found a 250-year-old bottle of whiskey, it'd still be okay. It's not going to rot. It's easier to transport. So if you wanted to take it into town and to sell it at market or something like that, much easier to haul than beer. Whiskey grain-based spirits became a very big economic item in the early American Republic. And there was also a kind of cultural thing that happened where rum became associated with the old world, the corrupt old world. America was a new version of the old world. Then there was a revolution and a revolt against it. Britain was big in the rum trade, which was connected to the slave trade. And saying no to rum and yes to American spirits was part of the American Revolution. Buy American, don't buy stuff that's associated with the mother country we're revolting against. And so, with that, whiskey just kind of took off. And it's been a curious relationship. We had prohibition here, just as you all did in Canada. Whiskey became demonized in the late 19th century and ultimately banned for a short time in the early 20th century. It became a dead category. There wasn't a whole lot interesting happening, not a lot of people drinking it. In the last 30 years, it's become kind of a recovered heritage, and it's become a big deal, and it's been a huge export for the United States. And it's kind of been melded into national identity to some degree.
Think bourbon, I think America. So
yeah, the US Congress some years ago did pass a resolution, not surprisingly sponsored by the people representing Kentucky, to deem it the official American spirit, and said resolution was enacted.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And actually, maybe continuing to your point there, sort of how whiskey has evolved over time. We're seeing a bit of a trend here, at least in Southern Ontario, of craft spirits becoming even more and more popular, and people maybe shifting away from higher volume, maybe drinking less but higher quality, or trying some craft or artisanal beverages and things of that nature. So I imagine the same is definitely happening down south where you are. Typically Canada lags the trends of the States a little bit. So maybe you can talk a little bit to that, your experience and maybe some new craft spirits and distilleries.
Yeah, Gary, you're absolutely right on. As a baseline trend, per capita drinking in the United States, and I believe the same has happened in Canada, since the 1970s has gone down. Yes, immigration and babies, there are more people, but per capita, it's gone down. Meanwhile, personal wealth has crept upwards. And so these trends have resulted in people kind of trading up, buying better. And, you know, it's happened in a variety of areas. I should mention, I mean, I can tell you, when I was in my teens in the 1980s, you know, most coffee that you could find was thin, bitter, served with non-dairy powdered creamer. There just wasn't a sophisticated taste there. Now, you know, obviously there's Starbucks everywhere. There's super boutique places where you're paying $8-10 for a cup of coffee that's, you know, made by somebody and using a cone filters and all this sort of stuff. Like, who would have thought? You know, same thing happened in the alcohol world. You know, you went from people mostly drinking, you know, cheap sugary wines that came in or imported from Portugal or pumped out in mass in California to, you know, drinking really refined high-end stuff. Beer, yeah, we had the home brewing and craft brew revolution that started in the early 70s and really, you know, caught speed in the 80s and 90s and just keeps going and going. Spirits were right behind that. Spirits were kind of the latest category to evolve. And yeah, I mean, gosh, when I first started drinking Canadian whiskeys, they were cheap blends. It was largely a uninteresting realm for me because it was like, oh, another Seagram's, oh, a VO, oh, Black Velvet. Oh, I mean, there was just a lot of stuff that was not particularly good. Now, I mean, there's fantastic single malts being put out, all rye whiskeys being put out. The market's responded to the change in times, and it's a great thing. Drink less, but drink better.
Would you say that, Kevin, you mentioned in the last 30 years or so, whiskey's become a lot more interesting in a country like the United States? And you mentioned as well the decades of craft beer becoming interesting in your country as well. A lot to do with, like, in the 1970s and 80s, home brewing became legal in the United States, and that incentivized and allowed a lot of Americans to experiment in their own homes, which created an interest in different flavors or variety. Would you say that that is connected with a high alcoholic spirit like whiskey? Were people starting to experiment with it? Is that why whiskey's become a lot more interesting in the last 30 years? Or is it a little bit more nuanced than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works at a couple of levels. In part, I think it's the logic of capitalism. Markets have this remarkable way of finding areas where there's insufficient competition and just fomenting it there. It's really something. I mean, you just watch it happen with just about everything. You know, tonight I'm sitting here enjoying a non-ale beer made by Brooklyn Brewery. You know, again, 30 years ago, the non-ale beers, there were about 2 brands sold in the United States, and they just were dreadful. You know, today there's dozens of non-ale beers, and they're good. They're really tasty. So yeah, capitalism has a way of finding markets. But I also think the kind of shaking off of the kind of limited taste palette that happened certainly in this country, in part because of the Great Depression and World War II. I mean, the foods that were available to Americans before, well, actually, Great Depression, World War II, World War I, before that time, what foods were available was very different. The markets were very localized, a lot of small farmers, a lot of diversity in there. After that point in time, what you had is a lot of mass mega production. You know, people are drinking stuff out of cans. They're eating stuff out of cans. You know, they had gotten through very lean times eating unpleasant stuff. So their kind of baseline expectations for food and drink had gotten lowered by the calamities. And, you know, I think that probably also happened in Canada. Certainly it happened in the United Kingdom. And people just kind of got along for a while. But then people started making better stuff. And people were like, whoa, why am I drinking this garbage? Like, let's do better. And then that just creates a race. Everybody wants to put something better out there and one up the other. You know, the fact that 50 years ago, people were watching Julia Child teach basic French cooking and were blown away by it. That's because their baseline was so low. And now you've got a bazillion cooking channels where people are doing unbelievably extreme things that Julia Child could have never imagined. I think that's what's happening with drinks too.
Excited to see where it's going. Further from here, right?
In terms of a current contemporary look at whiskey in the year 2023, who are the massive players on planet Earth in terms of both the production of whiskey and the consumption?
Yeah, well, when it comes to consumption, the real action, as far as producers are concerned, is in the Far East. It's in Africa. It's China, it's India, and it's some nations in Africa where the big companies, the Diageos and the like, are getting a toehold in there and putting their products out there. In many instances, they're putting stuff out there that is just there's no competition for. So it's new to market, and that makes it exciting. But they're also selling these things frequently as luxury goods. These are aspirational things. One of the funny things that's happened is in some of these countries, there's developed a whole kind of criminal market for knockoffs, fake Johnny Walkers and things like that, because people say, oh, I can't afford real Johnny Walker, but if I can buy one of these cheap fake ones and then I can put it up on a shelf in my home, people will think, oh, he's a rich man. He's a guy of luxury and taste. It's kind of like the fake Rolex watches that used to be sold in big cities on corners.
Designer bags.
The counterfeit good thing has got the fact that that's happening shows that there's real market activity over in these countries. And there, people are looking, who've been drinking traditional spirits are trading off of those to try something new, which heck, that happened in the United States. Scotch made its way in here after, a little bit during Prohibition, but primarily after World War II. Scotch made its way in and suddenly became a luxury good and very highly prized, and people started drinking lots of it. Same deal with vodka. These were spirits that were new to America. People were bored with the old stuff. Boom. As far as who is making it, it's the big players. It's hard to keep track of because there's so many of them being sucked up by conglomerates. I mean, it's like the same thing that had Budweiser, InBev, that sort of thing, where you just have company after company merging together into these multinationals so that they can wrap their brands together and push them out in different countries where different companies have different strengths, but they've got their supply lines, they've got their distribution channels, they've got all the relationships, they've greased the palms with government officials, whatever it takes. Conglomerization has happened a lot in spirits. I mean, Jim Beam Global, there was Jim Beam, which is a big American producer, just as an example, and they became Jim Beam Global, and then they got gobbled up by an even bigger conglomerate. I can't even remember who owns them these days. So you got that going on, but at the same time, you've got the kind of micro distilling thing that's also going on in earnest. Two concurrent trends. It's a wild time.
For sure.
If you're looking at more of a luxurious, chic side of whiskey, looking at the single malt scotches that typically are a higher end purchase for folks looking to experiment in the whiskey world, take that as an example. Are those Scotch whiskey companies, producers, are a lot of those by and large, maybe like the ones that seem to be independent, perhaps not? Is there a widespread sort of AB InBev culture happening there? Like when I look to see in my local liquor store what I ignorantly might think is a really good scotch that looks to be created by an independent producer. Am I being fooled, or are Scotch whiskey producers still by and large independent, family-owned businesses?
So there's certainly some that are independent. Others have been kind of tucked into conglomerates' portfolios. So they can still run themselves, but ultimately they're owned by some larger company. And that could be a blessing, or it could be a bad thing. I mean, there have been instances in the past where a conglomerate says, this brand is just not making its margins, and we feel like that it's kind of competing in the same flavor category as some other brand that we have that's doing better, so we'll just shut it down. That's in fact what happened to the Brookladdy distillery in Scotland. It was mothballed for 20 years or more just because a conglomerate decided, bye-bye, we don't need you anymore. And then they sold it off to, and some independent people started back up and got it up and running. There's also, certainly the creation of a lot of new brands. In Scotland, you've got people who will buy up barrels from a distillery, and then they'll hold the barrels on their own and then kind of release them under their own name. That's been done. There's a lot of folks who are also buying barrels and they're creating new blends. So, they're a whiskey maker, but they don't actually have a distillery. In the United States, it's even more confusing because you have a lot of entrepreneurs who are saying, like, I want to make my own whiskey, but I don't have the capital to build a distillery right now. And I don't have the time. So what I'm going to do is buy some spirits from a big factory in Indiana or some other place, pop those in a bottle, create my own brand, maybe buy a brand who died years ago and revive their history and claim I'm doing what they used to do. There's a lot going on. Absolutely. And yeah, you absolutely can get fooled into thinking you're buying some heritage brand that's been made by the same family when in fact, it's 3 years old.
Marketing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lying is a long part of the history of the whiskey world. It is. It just is. I mean, people were lying to their customers centuries ago about what was in the bottle, lying about the heritage, lying about, how the recipe was discovered. And they're doing it today. It still happens. People are telling tall tales because they're hoping to move products. I mean, I could tell you there's a prominent Scotch maker. They sat me down and they told me, oh yes, we definitely use the same recipe we used in the 1700s. I was like, no, you're not. That's just not true. And besides, the grains themselves have changed. You're not using the same heritage grains that you had in 1700s. And by the way, the recipe wasn't stable back then. I read the history. Like, well, that's life.
Mm-hmm.
And we traversed the space of whiskey nonetheless.
It's good to have that interesting historic insight that you have. Looking the other way into the future a little bit, do you see that a beverage like whiskey, is it doomed a little bit by a health conscious society that we seem to get further and further into? In Canada, we had some recent legislation come out, not legislation, I should say, but guidelines given to the Canadian population saying that you really, to be very healthy and to be very conscious of your alcohol intake, you should probably only have 2 alcoholic beverages per week. So do you see the further and further interest in health and physical betterment as perhaps antithetical to the growth and flourishing of whiskey?
Yeah, there seems to be kind of a collision of cultures. There's a public health viewpoint, which in the United States, now they're saying like, oh no, the science shows that there's no safe or healthy amount of alcohol. It's always bad to drink alcohol. You've got that going on. Certainly, a lot more people do care about their health, doing Pilates and fasting and things like that. Yet people are still people. The number of people who are obese these days is far higher than at any point in history. So, people are in a different place, I think. And how that conversation plays out, I don't know. I mean, it seems unlikely to me that we will see alcohol face a repeat of what happened to tobacco smoking. Tobacco smoking was a thing. It was a real thing. And now it's been just, in the United States, certainly, it's been very marginalized. It's no longer considered cool or up class or stylish. It's just been really pressed down. I don't think that's going to happen with alcohol. And moreover, since the growth markets for alcohol are primarily overseas, culturally, they're in a far different place. They're not all wound up in doing Pilates and, eating mung beans and that sort of stuff and agonizing. So no, I don't think that's going to happen. And, funny enough, the trends show that there's more whiskey being made today than ever before. And it's being made in more countries than ever before. Germans are making whiskey, French are making whiskey, India, Pakistan. Whiskey is being made almost everywhere. So I think whiskey's development as a product is going to continue to diversify, amaze, and give people who want to write about it and sample it a lot of work to do.
Gotta get your website roaring again.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll get a few more FedEx drivers popping by. I know we're coming up. Sorry, Andy. I know we're probably coming up on time soon enough, but I did want to ask, at least before we go, what's the highlight of your liquor cabinet, Kevin?
Oh, geez. What is the highlight? It's a cabinet of curiosities. I have a gin from Germany, which oddly enough is deep brown in color, and tastes more herbal than gin like. I have a bourbon made in California, which I was highly skeptical of, but wowed me. Got that in the cabinet. I have a Scotch blend that's brand new. I can't even remember its name. It's so new. Where they bought some single malts and put some neutral spirit and put that together, and it's really interesting. It's so delicate and it's so nuanced. So that's a good time. Yeah, it's a lot of weird stuff. Because people send me a lot of weird stuff, and when I see weird stuff, I tend to buy it.
Hold on to it. Yeah, I like that cabinet of curiosities. I feel like that's a good way to have a liquor cabinet. A little bit of everything.
Well, Kevin, we really do appreciate your time. We are coming up on our hour mark. I guess my final question for you, you have written a lot on American political figures. You wrote a book on Ronald Reagan. A lot of American presidents seem to be famous actually for their sobriety, some in particular. I know Jimmy Carter was a sober man. Former President Donald Trump was famous for his sobriety as well. Were there any American famous political figures, presidents perhaps, who were avid whiskey drinkers?
Yeah. Lyndon Johnson, who was president in the late 60s, he was a Scotch drinker. Dwight Eisenhower, who preceded him by a couple terms, he also enjoyed Scotch. Harry Truman, who was 2 terms before Eisenhower, he was a bourbon guy. Going back further still, Warren Harding. Ironically, he was president during Prohibition, but nonetheless kept bourbon around. And it goes all the way back. George Washington, the very first US president, he liked to drink a whole variety of things, everything from Madeira to beers. But he built a whiskey distillery on his property. And in fact, in the last 15 years or so, that distillery has been refurbished and reopened. And they are using the old recipe that Washington used, which he learned from a Scottish immigrant. So the history goes way back, whiskey and presidents. And certainly when it comes to our national legislature, whiskey in Congress, there's been a lot of it. When I worked at the Library of Congress, there was a special room in one of the library buildings called the members' room, and it was for members of Congress only historically. And there was a certain piece of furniture over there, a big square boxy thing that, the story had is that members would often keep their bottles over there. And, they would leave the main building, and when they took a break from legislating and come over and have a nice drink amidst the leather-bound books.
Very fascinating. Well, Kevin, we'd love to have you on again to pick your brain on whiskey and learn a little bit more. I know Garrett and I think we've learned a lot. So we really appreciate your time. Kevin Kosar, author of Whiskey, A Global History. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.